Were there not an Israel, the United States of America would have to invent an Israel to protect her interest in the region. The United States would have to go out and invent an Israel.
I've often said, Mr. President, if there were not an Israel, we'd have to invent one. I've long said, if Israel didn't exist, we'd have to invent it.
Israel has been brutally bombing Gaza for nearly a year. October 2024 is the 1-year anniversary of this brutal war on one of the most densely populated areas on Earth. Scientific experts published an article at the leading medical journal, The Lancet, estimating that 186,000 Gazans will die because of this brutal US-backed Israeli war. That is nearly 1/10 of the entire population dying. Top United Nations experts have clearly stated that Israel is committing the G crime, which I don't say because this will be censored in the algorithm. And these UN experts have also explicitly called for Western governments, in particular the US, to stop sending weapons to Israel, which it's then using to commit these war crimes. However, Israel continues brutally bombing Gaza with US weapons. And what is Israel's goal? Well, far-right Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu let the cat out of the bag. He really showed their intentions when he gave a presentation and he used a map of what he calls Israel, and he completely erased Palestine. The illegally Israeli-occupied West Bank is erased from the map. He does show Gaza, but of course, that's because Israel's goal right now is to ethnically cleanse all of the Palestinians, at least those who survive these crimes against humanity. He wants to kick them out and colonize all of historic Palestine. That is Israel's goal. It is to continue the Nakba, the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians upon which Israel was founded in 1948, when these colonialist militias ethnically cleansed and expelled the majority of the indigenous Palestinian population. This is, of course, exactly what the United States did to the indigenous peoples of modern-day North America, ethnically cleansing and killing off huge numbers of Native Americans through an explicitly colonial project known as Manifest Destiny. This is why, of course, it's not surprising that the United States so strongly supports Israel, because Israel is essentially a mini US located in one of the most geostrategic locations on Earth. It is an outpost for the US empire in West Asia, in the so-called Middle East, the region of the world with the most oil reserves, with the most gas, with many other natural resources, located right on the Mediterranean. And this is why the former US Secretary of State Alexander Haig famously said, quote, "Israel is the largest American aircraft carrier in the world that cannot be sunk. It does not carry even one American soldier," and that's actually not true. There are many US soldiers stationed in Israel. But he added, this former US Secretary of State added, that Israel is, quote, "located in a critical region for American national security," end quote. So this is a former head of the US State Department overseeing US foreign policy saying the quiet part loud, that Israel is an unsinkable aircraft carrier for the US empire, for Washington's power projection into one of the most strategic regions on Earth. And this brings me to the main point of this analysis today, which is that Israel could not wage this brutal war on Gaza without the support of the United States. The mass ethnic cleansing of Palestinians and Israel's colonialist policies are only possible due to the fact that the US empire is supporting it strongly, and Israel is acting in US interests to impose US hegemony in this region, to advance the interests of the US military-industrial complex and US capitalists who are profiting as they try to recolonize this region of the world where the European colonial powers were kicked out. The US is continuing, the US empire is continuing where the British Empire left off. Israel was a project of the British Empire, going back to the Balfour Declaration. In 1917, the British Empire gave a green light to the creation of the colonial state of Israel in historic Palestine, and the Zionist movement, this colonialist movement, had the support of the British Empire. The founding father of the political Zionist movement, Theodore Herzl, wrote letters to the British colonialist Cecil Rhodes, who colonized Africa, and Herzl asked Cecil Rhodes for support, boasting the Zionist movement was a colonialist movement based on the European colonial movements, colonial projects in Africa, in Latin America, and in Asia. So fast forward to today, in 2024, and the US empire continues this European colonial project.
I've long said, if Israel didn't exist, we'd have to invent it.
A report in the top Israeli newspaper, Haaretz, makes it very clear that the only reason that Israel can carry out this war and ethnic cleansing is because of the support it receives from the United States. This is a headline in Israel's top newspaper. Israeli Air Force official: without U.S. aid, Israel could not fight Gaza beyond a few months. This Israeli newspaper, Haaretz, notes that before 1967, the main sponsors of Israel were the British Empire and the French Empire. However, that changed, and since the 1967 war, when Israel began this occupation, not only of Palestinian territory, but also of Syrian and Egyptian territory, since that point, Israel has become an imperial protectorate of the U.S. empire. Haaretz notes that Israel switched over its dependence on a foreign power to the United States, and the U.S. provides the Israeli Air Force with all of its fighter planes and some of its bombs, missiles, and intelligence equipment. The U.S. also helps Israel to develop joint weapon systems, and a senior Israeli Air Force official told Haaretz that, quote, without the American supply of weapons to the Israel Defense Forces, especially the Air Force, Israel would have had a hard time sustaining its war for more than a few months, end quote. This point is absolutely crucial, and you cannot understand what is happening without keeping in mind this fact. And there are people in the U.S. who claim that Israel is the tail wagging the dog, which is nonsense. That's completely ridiculous. They do not understand the geopolitics of the situation. And in fact, that's a convenient excuse trying to justify the U.S. government's policy. They claim the U.S. government has no option. Israel controls the U.S. government. It's the Israel lobby. No, that's an excuse. That's an excuse that U.S. officials use to justify their complicity in crimes against humanity. Joe Biden says, Benjamin Netanyahu doesn't listen to us. No, if Joe Biden actually wanted to end these crimes against humanity, he could end them overnight. He could say the U.S. is no longer going to sell weapons to Israel. The U.S. is no longer going to give $3.8 billion of military aid every year to Israel. Biden could say the U.S. is no longer going to veto Security Council resolutions on behalf of Israel, which would mean that Israel would actually be held accountable under international law. But no, instead, the Biden administration has repeatedly vetoed Security Council resolutions that call for peace and a ceasefire in Gaza because the U.S. is actually pulling the strings here. And anyone saying that it's the Israel lobby or whatever, Israel's the tail wagging the dog, they are excusing the U.S. empire for its crimes against humanity. They are giving Biden an excuse. They are giving war criminal Joe Biden the excuse that he wants, so he can blame Netanyahu and say that it's all Netanyahu's fault, ignoring the fact that this is completely bipartisan in the United States because anti-imperialism is bipartisan, like the invasion of Iraq was bipartisan, like the US-led NATO destruction of Libya in 2011 was bipartisan, like the war on Syria was bipartisan, and the war in Afghanistan was bipartisan, and the war in Vietnam, and the war in Korea, and the war in Yugoslavia, and the invasion of Panama. The list goes on and on and on. The U.S. does not need Israel to commit war crimes and crimes against humanity because the U.S. is an empire and Israel is an extension of that empire. And it's very frustrating seeing people try to excuse the U.S. empire and instead say, oh, it's the Israel lobby. No, the Israel lobby is part of the U.S. empire. It's a faction of the U.S. empire. This is why the U.S. government gives Israel $3.8 billion of military aid every year unconditionally. And then every time there's a larger war, some kind of conflict, then the US gives many billions more. And as of July of 2024, the US, in just less than a year, from October to July, the Biden administration gave Israel $18 billion of military assistance. And this was before the announcement in August that the U.S. State Department had approved another $20 billion arms sale to Israel. And again, also in August, the U.S. State Department approved another package of $3.5 billion of weapons and military equipment for Israel. And when the State Department approved that arms deal on that same day in August, Israel used U.S. weapons in order to bomb a UN-run school in Gaza, killing over 100 Palestinian civilians. So it is the U.S. government pulling the strings. The only reason these atrocities can continue is because Washington supports them. Now, of course, the U.S. military-industrial complex is profiting from this. U.S. weapons corporations are making huge profits, and they fund politicians in Washington from both the Republican and Democratic parties, who then vote for these arms deals to Israel. And that money doesn't go to Israel. That money goes to U.S. weapons corporations, and they give those weapons and military equipment to Israel to carry out these atrocities in Gaza and to ethnically cleanse Palestinians on behalf of the U.S. empire. So it's the U.S. military-industrial complex that is ultimately profiting from all of this, not Israel. Again, Israel is an extension of the U.S. empire.
I've often said, Mr. President, if there were not an Israel, we'd have to invent one.
But what's so cynical is that the U.S. government will sometimes lightly criticize Netanyahu and the Israeli regime and say they're committing atrocities and we don't support those atrocities. But the U.S. continues to facilitate those atrocities. So, for instance, on the 30th of August, the spokesman of the U.S. State Department, Matthew Miller, said the IDF shooting of a World Food Program vehicle, that's the UN World Food Program, in Gaza is a deeply troubling incident. Humanitarian workers are there to help innocent civilians, and Israel must ensure they are protected. This is completely cynical public relations. The U.S. State Department actually doesn't care about Palestinian civilians or UN workers and other humanitarian workers. This is not the first time. This has happened dozens and dozens and dozens of times. And yet that same State Department that Matthew Miller is speaking on behalf of continues signing tens of billions of dollars of arms sales to Israel so Israel can keep killing UN workers, humanitarian workers. And then they say, oh, well, we're telling Netanyahu to protect civilians while we sell him more and more weapons. And while U.S. military contractors profit, and then they fund the U.S. politicians who vote for those arms sales to continue. And now we have Kamala Harris running for president for the Democratic Party. And she will sometimes lightly criticize Netanyahu, although she met with Netanyahu when he visited Washington. Kamala did an interview on CNN, and she did admit that, quote, far too many innocent Palestinians have been killed, end quote. But then she said at the same time that she's not going to end the U.S. policy of even withholding some U.S. weapons to Israel. So meet the new boss same as the old boss. She's continuing Biden's policy of saying, Netanyahu this, Netanyahu that. We don't like Netanyahu, but we're going to continue giving Netanyahu tens of billions of dollars of weapons to kill Palestinian children, because in reality, they don't care about Netanyahu or whoever is the figurehead in Israel. They will continue arming Israel because Israel is an outpost for the U.S. empire. As Secretary of State Alexander Haig said decades ago, quote, Israel is the largest American aircraft carrier in the world that cannot be sunk, end quote. Haig was Ronald Reagan's Secretary of State in the 80s. He said that back then. And of course, support for Israel has been completely bipartisan under Bush, under Clinton, under Trump, under Obama, under Biden. It has continued. Because without Israel, the U.S. empire would lose its control over one of the most geostrategic regions on Earth, West Asia, the so-called Middle East. It would lose its control over the global oil market and gas market. And of course, the petrodollar system is needed to maintain the U.S. dollar status as the global reserve currency. Without that, there would probably be very high inflation in the U.S., and U.S. capitalists would lose so much of their wealth, and living standards in the U.S. would fall drastically. Don't just take my word. It was current President Biden who admitted back in 1986, back when he was a senator, he said, if Israel did not exist, the U.S. would have to create Israel in order to serve U.S. imperial interests.
If we look at the Middle East, I think it's about time we stop, those of us who support, as most of us do, Israel in this body, for apologizing for our support for Israel. There's no apology to be made. None. It is the best $3 billion investment we make. Were there not an Israel, the United States of America would have to invent an Israel to protect her interest in the region. The United States would have to go out and invent an Israel. I am with my colleagues who are on the floor in the Foreign Relations Committee, and we worry at length about NATO. And we worry about the eastern flank of NATO, Greece and Turkey, and how important it is. They pale by comparison. They pale by comparison in terms of the benefit that accrues to the United States of America.
Biden then repeated that in 2022 as U.S. president. Here's that clip.
We're also going to discuss the ironclad commitment, and this is, I'll say this 5,000 times in my career, the ironclad commitment the United States has to Israel based on our principles, our ideas, our values. They're the same values. And I've often said, Mr. President, if there were not an Israel, we'd have to invent one.
And finally, Biden said the same thing in October 2023 as Israel launched this brutal war on Gaza.
I've long said, if Israel didn't exist, we'd have to invent it.
If you want more information about why the U.S. empire so strongly supports Israel and the geopolitical and economic interests driving Washington's support, you should check out the interview that I did with the economist Michael Hudson. I will link to that in the description below. But on that note, I'm going to conclude. I'm Ben Norton. I'm the editor-in-chief of Geopolitical Economy Report. Please like and subscribe. Please share this. I want to thank everyone for joining me today. And if you like the work that we do, please consider supporting us. Please consider donating. You can go to geopoliticaleconomy.com/support. And you can also go to patreon.com/geopoliticaleconomy. That's the best way you can become a patron there, help to sustain our work. We are totally independent. We rely entirely on small donations from viewers and listeners like you. So once again, thanks to everyone for joining me today. We will be back soon. See you all next time.